Good morning, everyone who's here, and welcome to this event. As more people are joining, I'm going to talk a little bit about the logistics and why are we here. So we are here to talk about Olay's book, Fundamentals of Data Management, and we're going to have Ask Me Anything format on any topic about metadata you have on your mind. Before we start, I want to do a quick introduction for myself and Olay. Ollie and I, we met when I first read his first book, which was about enterprise data catalog, and we've been in touch ever since. We've met at different places, different occasions, and I feel that Ollie has a deep thought level leadership on metadata. So I'm really excited for him to talk about his new book today. Myself, I've been in oil and gas sector doing data analytics and software engineering for about 17 years. Currently, I'm at Databricks enabling our different customers to use the platform effectively. With that, in terms of logistics, all the question and answers, please post them in Q&A section in your Zoom so that we can see them and prioritize them for our session today. Any conversation you need to have, obviously you can use the Zoom chat. You can't use the audio in this session. It's just Ollie and me who will be talking. But all your question and chat are welcome in chat and Q&A appropriately. Having said that, I think we can kick off. So Ollie, before we kick off, is there anything you want to say to the audience today?
Well, thank you everyone for coming. I think it's so early that the next couple of minutes people will still log on. But thank you for everyone for joining and continuously joining. And also, Abhay, thank you for wanting to do this. I mean, normally I interview people on this webinar series, so we turned the mics around because you reached out and had a lot of questions on LinkedIn, and you're not the only one. And then finally, I decided, well, why not just do an Ask Me Anything format, and you were up for it, and so thank you, Abhay, for taking the time to host this webinar.
No, I'm
Yes.
truly excited about this. I mean, this is a great book. It's like I don't remember seeing a book focused on metadata in a while. So thank you for taking time to write the book and
Well,
introducing metagrid to the world. I mean, it's a topic that a lot of people are trying to figure out. I guess what is metagrid? How do we use it? So I guess we can start with the metagrid. Like, what do you
right.
see is the value of metagrid once people understand metagrid and try to adopt it in their environments? How do you think that going, Ole?
So, writing the book, there were actually a lot of people reaching out to me saying this is exactly what we're doing in our company. And I guess I can reveal one guy called Gregor Robbe that reached out from UBS saying that he was building this kind of architecture. Many more reached out, but had to stay relatively discreet about it, so I couldn't cite them. But basically, the Metagrid architecture that I describe in my book is an architecture. It's a very small and slow and simple architecture to unite or coordinate, I should say, metadata across different metadata repositories. So it's actually the most, you could say, complicated topic of the book, because I talk about metadata in general in the book. But it is also an attempt to deliver an answer in a universe defined very much by the lack of open standards and the complexity of large IT landscapes with a lot of technical debt, a lot of political discussions, or tendencies in organizations, and a lot of uncertainty about what metadata is in general. So I didn't want to leave the reader without an answer, without some kind of perspective on how to solve the problems that I address. And that answer is the metagrid.
Fantastic, thank you. And those who have joined in the last few minutes, please feel free to post your question in Q&A section in Zoom. We just are getting started. I don't see any questions right now, Ole, so let's just start with one question I talked about Metagrid. What kind of motivated you to write the book in such detail that you've written? I think that's an important question too. the writing process itself. The nature of writing about technical topics is changing, and it's a traditional book format. Can you kind of talk to a little bit about the process itself? Like, how did you research about this topic? Why did you think that it was important to talk about metagrid in a consistent fashion, right?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Abhay. Think so. It's very like this book to, has been on my mind for a long time because I have worked in big industries in a lot of different verticals, but in particular in regulated industry and pharma. And throughout my career, I've seen this thing again and again, which is a lack of understanding of the IT landscape, like a fundamental lack of understanding of the IT landscape in a company. Classical questions. How many applications do we have? How are they integrated? What types of data do they contain? To what extent is that data PII, like personal identifiable information? To what extent is it confidential? What is the reality of our physical infrastructure, our servers? Where are they located? What's their name? Who owns them? Like all of the elements in the IT landscape in a company is extremely opaque. And in my first book, I explored the data catalog as a super effective solution to surface the data in the IT landscape in a company, right? And I believe deeply in data catalogs. I essentially I believe deeply in all the technologies we use for various types of tasks in companies. But I saw that many of these technologies are implemented in silos. So I've seen that as an enterprise architect, as a data leader in many different companies. I'm quite certain that it's the reality in every big company of a certain scale, industrial companies, right? And so I wanted to write a book about that topic. And it's complicated because it's about reality. So it's not about ideal architectures. It's not about programming languages and greenfield design ideas. It's about the reality, and the reality is something different, right? So that's the book in its core essence. It's a book about all the different types of technologies we use to perform metadata management, and there are quite a lot. And a lot of problems arise out of that. I was actually recently asked by someone that's pretty smart if I should describe my book in one sentence, what would it be? And I think my answer to that is companies typically have more than one data catalog.
Good.
And so if you think about that answer, then you can begin thinking about, okay, so what is it you represent in one data catalog? What is it you represent in another? And what's the link between these technologies? And if you expand that to say, okay, but we also have configuration management databases and asset management systems and learning management systems and information security management systems, a lot of different technologies that do not actually perform something in the value chain. They just look at the entire IT infrastructure that is performing the value chain. It's just metadata. And so how is that connected? That is what the book is about.
Fantastic. That's how I read the book. I'm like, okay, there are all these catalogs. Well, how do we make sense of them, right?
Yeah.
But talking about data catalogs, I think one interesting thing we're seeing because of AI, and I know we're jumping straight to AI now, but I think it's an
Sure.
important question. Like the role of catalogs in AI, like it used to be that you organize the catalog, you try to have a centralized enterprise catalog, and you have, all these different catalogs in different places, as you mentioned, asset management, security, learning management systems, so many of them, right? The With the advances of AI, where conversational interfaces are becoming kind of more user friendly, I would say. Like, do you see the role of these catalogs becoming even more important, or how do you see this transition or this change in terms of how people interact with catalogs, right?
Oh yeah, great question. So I think, and I partly discussed that in my book, but it's also a little outside of the book. But that doesn't matter because I also do discuss it in my book a little bit. So the way I see people interacting with catalogs in the age of AI has actually changed quite substantially. Because of two things. What we do in data catalogs will, just as in every other metadata repository, be augmented by AI. So a lot of things that are going on in the data catalog will be augmented, is being augmented by AI. And that is a delicate development because some things can be improved by AI or augmented, and some things cannot. We're simply talking about the laws of semantics here. Like certain things will be augmented, and other things won't. So that is definitely something that is changing with AI. It's the behavior, it's the actual performance of metadata management inside, in this case, a data catalog. But then on the other side, I think data catalogs are also becoming sources themselves, which is a completely new thing, a shift in the way metadata management is being performed. So instead of just registering a lot of sources, like the core element of, like the core definition of metadata that I put forward in my book is that it is in two places at once, so that it can serve its purpose, namely making stuff discoverable, searchable, and discoverable. And think of Amazon, for example, or any other online bookshop, right? You search on that online bookshop, and then you find a book. Now, the metadata is what ties together the object that you find on that the online bookshop and the object itself. So that could be the title, it could be the publisher, it could be the author. All of that is metadata, and it is essentially in two places at once, right? So that's the traditional role of metadata. It's to be in two places at once, so that we can discover and find and use and manage and govern the things themselves, be it servers, be it data sets, computers, whatever. But with the introduction of AI, we also see that metadata structures, especially ontologies, are becoming very, very valuable sources themselves. So like the entire rise of model context protocol and agent-to-agent protocol is something that really testifies to the new role of metadata, which is to be a source. And I describe that in my book, at the end of my book, using the metagrid architecture as a source for AI.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think, yeah, it's one of those things that are emerging, and it would be interesting to see how this plays out. Because the reason I asked this question was really about, the semantics used to live close to where the business users were, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking whether semantics should live close to the catalog now, right? Because, if people have their own semantics close to the edge or close to where they're using this data, where does it make most sense to have that data, right? I think, what are views on that? Where should semantics live? Like, in the business intelligence visualization tools or close to the catalog, right? Or maybe a centralized catalog if there is one, or if people are trying to have a centralized catalog. Have you thought about
Yeah,
that? Is there, yeah.
yeah. I think there are no right or wrongs in what you're saying. I want to I want to flip flop it a little bit in the sense that I I think a measure of success should be that your business users, your end users, do not consider a data catalog as something that is far away from the business users.
Right.
I think the semantics being very close to every single employee, end users, if you will, that should be in a catalog. That should not be something that is very far away from a catalog or any other metadata repository. So that's my ideal. But basically, I think you will not be able to have one solution or one particular setup. I think metadata will live in many different solutions, many different storage solutions and technologies, pretty much forever. Like that is just how metadata behaves.
Yeah. We have a couple of
Yeah.
questions in Q&A. Let me take the first question here. So one of the question is, does a serialized AI model dependent on this, or is there an architecture exclusive to a serialized model? I think the way I read that question is, I think probably we need some more clarification on that question. But there's a first question about how critical is the data catalog and industry data model in adoption of AI model. I think that's a pertinent question, an important question, right? Like in AI adoption, what role does the data catalog really play, and how important is it, right?
Yeah, I think it's super important if your data catalog is built in the right way. And I want to say this now. I know we're with like I am the chief evangelist in Actian, and I believe deeply in our technology. But keeping it vendor agnostic, I still want to say something that I think is not technology agnostic, because I think the days of the knowledge graph powered data catalogs, at least if you have the ambition to be like an enterprise catalog that is for the entire enterprise, I think the days of those catalogs that are not powered by knowledge graphs are over. And I see AI as a very, very strong sign of that. So back to the question, that's why I mentioned this. In the adoption of AI, data catalogs play a huge role simply because they can be built on a knowledge graph, and that knowledge graph will be able to provide context for AI use cases, for many different types of AI use cases. For example, data analytics. Knowledge graphs are capable of delivering very precious context so that you can improve the AI performed data analytics with a touch of human intelligence through the graph. So I think like, so to answer the question in a simple way, I think data catalogs play a huge role in AI adoption, quite honestly.
Okay, the way I understood it, Ole, is that you're talking about catalogs powered by knowledge graph are kind of very crucial to making AI work in a relevant fashion. Is that kind of a good summary of what you're talking about in terms of knowledge graph? And
yeah, sure, it's a very popular pattern, right? Knowledge graph plus large language models is something that is super interesting because, say, the large language model is the text, and the knowledge graph is the context. So,
right.
So that is a very nice way of combining technologies to achieve better outcomes for AI. And it just so happens that data catalogs, they are either built on or connect to or are expanded by knowledge graphs, and that knowledge graph context is something that is really precious for AI use cases.
Fantastic. The second question, I think once I get clarity on that, I'll ask that. But let's go to kind of fundamentals. You know, your book is about fundamentals. How, in your worldview, how you define metadata? What is the criteria when you say something is metadata? How do you kind of think about that? Like, okay, this is metadata, right? Because the thing is, you know, people could call units of metadata. People will call, you know, the vector embeddings of metadata. I mean, there's so many things that could be tagged as metadata. So I was very interested in learning about your thought process. Like, how do we say that, oh, this truly is metadata, and this is kind of, or do we define it by use case? Like, how do we approach definition of metadata in an enterprise, in a you know, enterprise environment, or for use case, whichever way you think about it, right?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Abhay. I think that so to start, and I've been bashing the data management community lately, so why don't I continue? I think the way metadata has been defined in traditional data management literature, data engineering literature, and there's a couple of exemptions, but in much literature, I unfortunately find definitions of metadata that are simply lists of subcategories of metadata. So, for example, the typical types of subcategories would be listed as technical metadata, operational metadata, business metadata. And so these explanations, you find them in a lot of books. They say, okay, metadata comes in various types. It comes in these technical types, these operational types, and these business types. And there's really nothing wrong with these lists, but like philosophically, and I know this is a dangerous word in a tech context, but philosophically, yeah, um, philosophically, you cannot really define anything by just listing subcategories. That's not a definition. That's just a list of subcategories. You don't capture the essence of what you're talking about. And so back to your questions, couldn't everything be like a vector embedding? Why is that not metadata? Well, it can be. Obviously, it can be. Because the core definition of metadata, as I see it, and I stand on the shoulders of centuries of library information science and library practice, which is my education. I have an academic background in this field. Metadata is about something. Metadata basically is in two places at once. That is the definition of metadata, meaning that it is not what it is, but where it is that characterizes metadata. Metadata can be anything. It can be operational, it can be technical, it can be business, it can be a lot of other, it can be social media metadata. Like you can list whatever subcategory you want. That's not the essence of metadata. It's where it is. And it's in two places at once. That's what characterizes metadata. It needs to be in two places at once. So yes, a vector embedding, why not list that somewhere to find that vector embedding? Then it becomes metadata.
Okay, and there's a fundamental question. I mean, I'm not going to get into philosophy. Like, business wants data they can trust. I think let's talk about that. And data that is trusted sometimes. People speak in terms of truth. This is the data we can trust, right? So, in terms of your definition of metadata, how do we, like, how many layers and how much lineage, and how do we kind of build a lineage that did not exist to kind of get to the definition of trusted data? How should we approach that in enterprises where typically metadata management hasn't been a priority, right? Like, how do we now think about that and tackle that head on, right?
I think that we're witnessing something that is quite significant. I think we're witnessing a substantial shift in prioritization of strategic initiatives in companies, going from data scientific ambitions with structured data to AI ambitions based on unstructured data.
Right.
And so I think a lot of studies document that, like, and they say a lot of different things, these studies. The MIT study, for example, recently listed that 95% of all AI projects have no ROI. Now, you can discuss the details of that study. Is it even fair to do this analysis at this point in time? Are the metrics right? I think that the critics have some very good points about the metrics in this study. But the study itself proves that the strategic interest, like the C-level conversations in companies, had fundamentally changed towards AI. That is out of discussion. Like every company in the world with a bit of ambition wants to push forward on an AI agenda. What does that take? Well, suddenly it doesn't only take structured data, it also takes unstructured data, right? So
Right.
building and that unstructured data is in the format of text, of pictures, of everything that vector embeddings help solve, right? Speaking of that. And so, so I think that metadata in this context is suddenly part. It's suddenly part of these very, very strategic conversations at the C level. It's not something that engineers or compliance people are trying to push. It's actually a very important ingredient in being successful with AI, because it can deliver so much context, because it can deliver that increase of precision, that better performing AI. And I think more and more C-levels are beginning to understand that. And I think that traditional data management actually finds itself in a bit of a challenge. Like if you are in traditional BI, if you've been a traditional data engineer building pipelines for more established data analytics disciplines, then I think that the strategic funding in your company is about to change, and you should adapt to that situation. And that, I think, is something that is really turning the data community around these years. That like the hierarchy between structured and unstructured data is changing. The role of metadata is morphing into something else. It's becoming part of the C-suite discussions because of AI, and a lot of more traditional scientific machine learning projects, which are all really cool. Like I have absolutely no disrespect for these disciplines, but they will have to face a different kind of conversation to get into the C-suite conversations. So that's how I see it changing. And I'm building trust in data. Well, I think it will take the same things as before, right? If you're talking about structured data, pretty much.
Right. Yeah. My question was more like, obviously that's like it's about, constant battle, building trust in data, right? And obviously metadata and lineage plays a huge role. So, as you said, as we confront AI with, we cannot trust AI responses. So we need to ground it to lineage and metadata and knowledge graphs, ontologies that you mentioned, right? So those are the things I think people are working on. We have other questions about serialized AI model. My understanding of serialized AI models is models we can save and kind of retrieve when we need them. The question is really around, is there a recommended metadata management architecture to support the deployment and life cycle of a serialized AI model?
Well, I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but I would say that making use of model context protocol to enable knowledge graphs to be consumed for increased precision is something that is really recommendable. And by that, I mean, look at technologies that have an MCP server or an MCP connector that make their data available on an MCP server. So if your AI technologies, if your AI projects want to increase their precision with metadata, then connecting to an MCP server is a way to possibly increase that. So in any metadata management strategy that works with AI, I think that is a fundamental building block that you can't ignore. I hope that answers the question, and if not, please expand.
Yeah, I'll monitor Q&A if there's follow-up. But talking about, since we're talking about AI and metadata, and we also talked about kind of definition of metadata quite a bit. One of the phenomena of, common usage pattern of AI is kind of summarization. People summarize long documents and, then the thing that kind of contains the essence of that document. What is your view on that? Do you think auto summaries or AI summaries are a useful metadata, or it's a noise that you can't really turn off? It's just added to the overhead of our common misunderstanding,
I
Like, how
think,
do you, yeah.
well, my take on that is that we're just in the beginning of this. So this will become way better. I think actually we're beginning to see some really cool results in that particular domain. So no, I'm not at all annoyed by that, and I think the precision again. I think the precision will increase over time. But I think one call to action is to begin to think very carefully about the unique actions that you perform in the enterprise. I think some very old school disciplines, such as building a business glossary and
Right.
understanding your taxonomies and your ontologies in the various technologies that you make use of, is something that should have like top priority attention, because it will increase everything AI. It's really needed, right? So that I think is something that will see increased attention.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I even thought about the same topic. I'm like, okay, well, you gotta fine tune the models based on your glossary that's prevalent in kind of your space. Otherwise, you're gonna get this AI generated glossary and word and usage that's not gonna be scalable, you know. So you gotta probably fine tune the model so that it responds in a way that employees in your company or in your enterprise understand it, right? So, okay.
Indeed. Can I just comment on that, Abby?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because I think one of the real interesting aspects here is that you cannot automate the creation of a business glossary. That's an illusion.
Correct.
You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't even try to do that. The problem you're facing is that you're creating, like, if we were to use a long word, a tautology, but a more simple word would just be a repetition. You're not extracting anything from anywhere. We're just repeating stuff. And so trying to repeat stuff at the metadata level and say, now we have a business glossary, now we have a list of terms, or even create an ontology simply based of AI, would be very messy and very unproductive. And the thing is, if you do that human activity in the beginning of creating either a business glossary or taxonomy, or even an ontology, right? Like a graph that you create,
Yeah.
that really unifies the understanding of your enterprise. If you do that, and you use that as a source for improving AI, then you get great benefits. You could make the activity of tagging. So a very basic example, you could make the activity of tagging data products or data assets in a data catalog, something that activity AI could perform. But if you have created the business glossary with which you tag these data products, if you created that business glossary with AI, the entire activity falls apart. It won't deliver any value. So you can automate repetitions, but you cannot automate unique human actions. The creation of the word itself is something that a human needs to do.
Exactly. No, I think that resonates with me. That's what I was saying, that you cannot rely on AI for things like glossary, because
No.
that's not a recipe for huge success. Okay, so talking about AI and generative content. What are your kind of some of the recommended strategies, like in the AI world? Have you thought about? I don't think you've written this in the book itself, but with the AI, how should the workflow of developing metadata should look like? You're talking about existing repositories. Like, how do we look at them? How do we augment them with AI? How do we kind of bring them to discovery enterprise-wide? Have you given this a thought quite a bit, or what are your thoughts
Yeah,
initially? I guess, yeah.
sure. So in my book, I make it very clear that I don't think that a metagrid architecture is something that you should put into one specific technology. It is really about making the existing technology stack and metadata tech stack that you have in your company better. So if you have a data catalog, or 2 data catalogs, or 5 data catalogs, what I suggest is certainly not a new layer on top of all these data catalogs to unite them all. I think they do that internally themselves. And one of those 5 data catalogs could be the enterprise data catalog, and that is just fine. I don't propose another layer on top and you get another technology. What I propose is a methodology of uniting organizationally all the teams that are working with technologies so that they can learn from each other and improve from each other. And then if we really push forward, so for example, imagine list of applications in an enterprise architecture management tool with great descriptions, like dedicated for future exploration of how you could make your IT landscape more cost effective, more powerful. If you take that list and you coordinate closely with a configuration management database, then you all of a sudden have a better configuration management database, a more updated, a more ready configuration management database once these things are handed over to that other team. And if you take all these teams and all these technologies and explore how they work together, then you can improve the total amount of technologies and how they're performing. So you can save a lot of time. But since you ask about AI, you can also use that documentation, all these diagrams, all these descriptions of data, metadata types, and you can put that into, you can create a sort of RAG architecture that you could potentially have a conversation with, right? Like asking about what kind of metadata repositories are used for what kind of things, right? And explore that horizontally. But being a technology in itself, I don't think that would be the point. I want to improve the existing technologies.
Okay.
Make it
that makes sense.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense. So let's talk about, we haven't used the governance word so far, but let's use that. A lot of metadata initiatives, like they kind of die from the governance fatigue, so to speak, right? Like, how do we think about governance when we are talking about, metadata initiatives? Like, what role does governance play, and how small or how big that needs to be? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, so I think I would cut it up in 2 questions actually.
Right.
So one question is about data governance, and another question would be about governance in general. So data
Right.
governance, I think, is something that is typically performed. Yeah, I don't like data governance is typically performed in a relatively siloed way. I wish that more companies would be more holistic in their data governance perspectives. Some companies are definitely have some great authors and like thought leaders out there explaining this. But data governance activities as a dedicated discipline, I think, should work more horizontally in the organization. And that brings me, and I can explain this by talking about governance in more general terms. So you also have a chief information security officer or a data protection officer, or even like quality people that works with measuring the level of training. Is it is it sufficient, and so forth, right? If you're in a regulated industry, you need to know the processes you work with and so forth. So I think a governance aspect altogether is bigger than simply data governance. I
Right.
really encourage data governance people to work with other governance and compliance functions in the company to actually improve, to save a lot of time and improve the quality of the metadata and their technologies to be able to work together and create more efficient results.
No, that's fantastic. No, thank you for that. I think your answer kind of reminded me another aspect you touch upon in your book is the dark metadata. Could you talk a little bit about that, and how are you talking about that in your book, and what do we really mean by dark metadata or dark data? Like, how do we think about that, right?
Come again, about wrapped metadata, or what do you say?
No, I think you're talking about the dark metadata and the
Oh,
dark.
dark
Yeah.
metadata. Yes, thank you. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I love that because that you bring it up because that is really something that is close to my heart. Like we're talking about dark data that we haven't discovered with our technologies yet, that we haven't mapped, and I believe in that. But dark metadata is something that is quite it's actually quite simple to explain, right? Every time we implement a new technology to look at our IT landscape, we start, unfortunately, I have found, and this has resonated with readers quite like all over the world, to be honest. We start at a whiteboard. We begin by explaining where we should, what kind of structure our company has, what kind of employees, what kind of data, and so forth. So we begin from scratch. We begin at a green field every single time we implement a metadata technology. And I believe that is wrong because all the semantics, everything we're trying to map, it already exists. It exists in technologies that we're not aware of because we typically work in a very siloed approach, right? So think of, for example, implementing a data catalog. That would be a bunch of data engineers, data scientists, AI analysts, and what have you, strategists that work together on implementing a data catalog. But if they interviewed the asset management system team, that would typically be sitting in finance, or if they interviewed the records and information management team, yet another compliance function, typically sitting in quality or legal, they would get much of the semantics, much of the metadata that they're like trying to deduct themselves in a silo. They would get it just out of the box. And so that's my dark metadata. It's all the metadata that is already sitting out there in your organization. And that's the reality in every single organization out there, right? Every single company has that dark metadata sitting in a lot of different systems undiscovered. And it's just there for the taking. And if you take it and use it, you can push faster, way faster, with your initiatives of like getting value of metadata for AI or simply implementing new technologies. So that's dark metadata. It's really this concept that I think we're ignoring the reality of the metadata already existing in companies. It has to do with the way companies push forward these agendas. It's always pushed forward with new technology in a combination of internal employees that wants to be successful, that wants to get promoted, consultants that help these companies implement technologies, and then technology vendors that has created the software, right?
Yeah.
So there's no way around that, and that is a reality that you can sometimes be very annoyed at, but that's just the reality. Like you cannot step out of that. So how do we use that reality to create something better, faster, smarter? Well, my answer is quite simply look at the metadata that already exists. Look outside of your silo. If you're in data analytics, if you're a data scientist, if you are in AI, look at the endpoint management system that the service desk is using to hand out laptops and iPhones for new employees. That system contains a lot of semantics. Look in the knowledge management system that was implemented 10, 15 years ago. There's a lot of semantics. Don't let that go to waste. That's dark metadata.
I think you're hinting at kind of thinking about looking at metadata and connecting disciplines across to kind of meet your business objective rather than doing it in silos. Am I inferring your answer correctly? Like you're looking at existing data and trying to connect the dots to build out to meet your objectives. You're looking at endpoints, you're looking at knowledge management. Knowledge management is a huge kind of a place where there's a lot of metadata about the organizational competency in terms of employees, right? So I think you're talking about using those existing metadata to inform future development programs, and rather than building a new system altogether to gauge, how employees are doing. I think that's what you're hinting at, right? That's how I took it.
Well, the purpose of my book is really not to say that you shouldn't implement technology and you should give up and everything is a mess. What I'm saying is that companies typically find themselves in a mess, but there's a way out of the mess, and that
Exactly.
mess takes that
Yeah.
that mess is actually something that is extremely powerful if you just use it. If you uncover all the metadata in that mess, you can actually improve the existing technologies, and you can increase the likelihood of success when implementing new technologies. So I'm not against anything here. I'm not against technologies. I'm not against companies or persons or consultants. Um, I'm saying that we're working in a way that's not the best way. We can do something different. And that is the metagrid. The metagrid architecture is really saying, don't try to explore what applications a company has. Don't try to explore what data types it has. It is already listed. It is already out there. Go find those other metadata repositories and benefit from that. Harness it. Use it instead of wasting your time with yet another unrealistic greenfield project. That's that's the thinking in the metagrid architecture. Link. If
Exactly.
you
That's what I was hinting at too. I'm like, don't discard what you already have, build upon it, right? That's what I was saying.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
getting at.
exactly. And I think we're often caught in a mechanic that incentivizes the contrary. We're often caught in greenfield projects because they are so seductive. If you have no legacy, everything is simple. But the
Right.
problem is, even though you can implement that in a small bubble, in a little silo of yours, it will never really scale because it doesn't address the world around it, right? So you may be able to like get off the ground and do some interesting work. But if you really want to scale, you need to talk to your peers. You need to engage with the people around you.
Yep.
And
Yeah,
for
that's what I
and
was exactly. That's exactly how I took it, and that's how I was saying. I'm like, you look at existing assets that you have, you interconnect them and make sense of them. Even if you're doing greenfield project, they need to be informed by existing assets that you have in terms of metadata or data, right? So.
yeah,
Um, So I think we touched upon, the graph, knowledge graph, ontologies, and the one question that I had in that regard was like, what is your decision test when to choose the graph or the ontology models versus a simple key value pair, right? Like, how do we go about thinking when do we actually need knowledge graph and elaborate ontologies and things of that sort rather than just key value document, right?
I I think we are now approaching the 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 like the subtle border of advice and ideals.
Right.
My ideals, I want to make them very clear. They are based on my own experience, but I welcome people to differ. But the way I see it is that you would be wise to choose. It's wise to choose a graph, a metadata at the metadata level. So knowledge graphs are extremely efficient at the metadata level. For everything metadata management, they are really great. And I know data catalogs based on graphs. I know enterprise architecture management tools based on graphs. And I know other types of metadata tools, knowledge management tools also that are based on graphs. And I find graphs to work really, really well at the metadata layer. At the data layer itself, uh, I I'm not sure you can run an entire company on a graph database. I'm not sure I would advise for that. So that's where my distinction goes. It's between the data and the metadata layer. Now some will differ in that, and that's completely fine. That's just how I see it. What I've seen work is that I know graphs are extremely potent at the metadata layer.
Okay, we're coming to the top of the hour. If there are more questions from audience, please feel free to put that in question and answer. I know you have a hard stop, Ole, and I do as
Yes.
well. So, let me see. While we're waiting for more questions, I guess I may have one more question, one final question from my side. Um, you know, a company who doesn't really have a lot of metadata already, and they are kind of doing greenfield. It's a startup environment, something like that. How should they approach? There's no concept of metagrid because they don't really, have where they can tap into existing. What is your thinking around in that environment? Completely greenfield environment, and AI is kind of powered by metadata. Embeddings and all kind of things. Like, what is your ideal approach to metadata management in a very greenfield environment? How do you think people should be thinking about that in that kind of environment, right?
Oh, well, in that kind of environment, I think I'm going to sound like such an old man, but I think doing your documentation up front will save you a lot of time down the road. So it's the typical startup problem, right? That you're so
Yeah.
little that you don't need to do the documentation, and then you grow, and then you explode, and then you can't find anything anymore, right? But if
Yeah.
if you're capable of doing your documentation up front, and perhaps now in this era, I think you're capable of harnessing the results of like proper metadata management instantaneously. And so I think that is a game changer, right? That because we're in this AI race, you can really use the metadata that you have registered effectively instantaneously. And so that I think changes, that's a game changer, a real game changer.
No, I think
So,
that resonates with me. I think for a while we were from a time where we don't need documentation, but now there's machines need a lot of context and documents to answer accurately. So we're going back to the point where we need to have this kind of documentation to be successful with AI in particular. If we're looking for truth, right, from these systems.
exactly, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess if there are no other questions, I'm happy to wrap it off, Abhay, unless you had another question.
No, I think we're good to wrap up. And thank you so much for taking time today. There are no more questions. I think we can wrap it off. And thank you again.
Okay.
I hope it was useful for audience. And I am looking forward to seeing if there is a further interest in having another discussion around metadata, or maybe more kind of tailored towards how this is kind of being utilized in industry already. I'm sure we'll connect and figure it out.
Sure. And Abhay, I'll see you around in the world for Databricks events or Actian events, or maybe joint events. Who knows?
Exactly, for sure. I'll see you. Take care.